Greetings and various assorted salutations. Welcome to the fourth lecture for World War II, Part 1. What we're looking at today is the Pearl Harbor lecture, or as some might call it, America Enters World War II lecture for my U.S. History 3 course. In case you're wondering, this follows 14.3 in the current version of our textbook. Here's our terms list. And let's get into it. Now, we're going to be focusing mainly on the Japanese at first. The Japanese, which I have not given much mention to yet, really have their own government go totalitarian in their own distinct flavor. Their story differs from Germany or Italy. Japan modernized after the United States forced open trade with the Black Fleet. And looking out over the world, this island nation, the nation of the rising sun, had seen the British Empire grow to the point where the sun never set on her lands, and they saw the ancient, long-reigning Middle Kingdom, China, crumple before imperial powers like Britain in both battle and drugs, such as the Opium Wars. Additionally, the Kingdom of Korea was absorbed in the land game of world powers, and Vietnam reduced to a colony by the French. And so the Japanese have a very different perspective on colonies and empire building than what we see in Europe. But here's kind of a quick little timeline of events for modern Japanese history leading up to World War II. Kind of the first thing, when I was talking about the Japanese observed these different places fall, in 1635, they put in a law that banned Europeans and Catholicism, with the idea that in order to preserve Japanese culture and not go by way of China, they needed to keep Europeans out. Primarily at this time period, they were worried about the Portuguese. Skip forward a few centuries, and in 1854, the United States will reopen trade with Japan using what is referred to as the Black Fleet under the command of Commodore Perry. Essentially, the Black Fleet is this technologically advanced fleet developed by the United States. We sail into Japan, and we open them up at gunpoint. After that is the Meiji Restoration, where Japan really modernizes its government structure and begins kind of a configuration into a Western-styled government with a lot of imperialist influences. We also see the Sino-Japanese War, the first one, the Russo-Japanese War, which is started by a surprise attack on a key Russian harbor. And this war is significant because this is one of the first times that in the more recent era where a non-European power defeated a European power. In World War I, the Japanese fought alongside the Allies, and then from here we get into what we've talked about before: the Manchuria incident and Japan leaving the League of Nations, and the Second Sino-Japanese War. But going back into that mind frame that the Japanese have, Japan also saw America as a model moving forward. America was a former colonial holding, this obscure nation from the so-called New World had gone from like 13 backwater colonies to a grand nation spanning 2 oceans. And Japan saw that as, if they can do it, why can't we do it? We have more to start with. And so, especially following the Great War, Japan gets more and more involved in taking over and expanding they're expanding their holdings into portions of China, Taiwan, Korea, and more. As I mentioned before, the Japanese in the 1930s carry out a series of aggressive expansions into China, and this is really just part of a nationalist program that some Japanese developed called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. What this was is the idea was a political unity that sought to absorb many European colonies in Asia and turn Asia, the Asian continent, so like Asia, Southeast Asia, into a Western free alliance of people, and it would be heavily directed by the Japanese interests. Now, the idea behind this sphere was to also serve as a counterpoint to the growing influence of the United States, which sat on the opposite end of the Pacific. Japanese nationalists, especially the less of the United Asia, many Japanese nationalists saw that the greater coast prosperity sphere as the foundation of a grand, sprawling Japanese empire. But this is kind of a map of some of the properties that the greater coast prosperity sphere would include. They also had interest in expanding south, expanding over towards into the Indian Ocean, and in various Pacific holdings here. The other reason this is an important region is we're talking about access to rubber, oil, spices, seafood, quinine, coal, and more. To give you an idea how valuable these lands are, many of the present-day economic powerhouses are located in here. Japan, China, South Korea, as well as the economic successes of Singapore, Taiwan, and Hong Kong are all in this area. So the greater co-prosperity sphere would have been a really great jumping off point for a very powerful and influential empire. There's a picture of the Black Fleet, according to Japanese depiction, I believe. Now, we have some diplomatic relations we need to look at before Pearl Harbor. As stated before, the Japanese, as they expanded into China with the Second Sino-Japanese War, they bumped into European powers. The Peine incident is an example of when they bumped into the Americans. But a few more pop up in the 1930s. And one of the things that's kind of pervading throughout this, it's not always emphasized nowadays because people don't think about it as much, but there was a mentality between the Japanese and U.S. military elites that one day there would be a fight for dominance in the Pacific, and the United States expected that it would be with the Japanese, and the Japanese expected it would be with the United States. What makes World War II significant is that the Imperial Japan saw this conflict as a more immediate eventuality than the United States. However, in order to carry out this war, the Japanese needed lots of time and lots of resources. Several military experts in Japan felt that the United States would be akin to poking a sleeping bear or monster. And so many operations would be carried out before Pearl Harbor, before the United States would actually formally enter the war. Particularly disturbing is one incident, one horrifying incident out of the Second Sino-Japanese War. This was one that reached many Americans back home and deeply disturbed them, was the rape of Nanking. Essentially what many Americans were hearing from European and American correspondents living in China is that the Japanese imperial military was kind of, pillaging and butchering and raping their way across China. And this is perhaps one of the bloodiest incidences of this particularly ugly war. I've got some stuff here on it. Nanking is a major financial center located in this area. And essentially, the exact numbers are hard to pin down because, the records aren't that good, and a lot of governments have been in that area between them. The Japanese ruled this area. There was conflict during one of the Chinese revolutions, civil wars in this area. But here are the rough estimates of the numbers. It's estimated between 200 and 300,000 Chinese civilians and soldiers around the city of Nanking were killed. Between 20,000 and 80,000 women were sexually assaulted. And there's great amounts of property damage. There was murder. pillaging, all of these things. Essentially, the Japanese military went on for about 6 weeks doing these things. And the reason why we know a bit about the rape of Nanking is there is a large foreigner presence in this area. There were a number of Americans, British, German, and French people who lived and worked in the city. And during this attack, after the city fell, they put together the Nanking Safety Zone, where Chinese civilians could supposedly be safe. However, we have accounts from the Chinese and from these different foreign expats detailing that occasionally Japanese officers would drag people out of the safe zone and, well, do other things. One particular account, one particularly famous person, you can actually see plaques and monuments to him today, is the account by John Rabb, who was a German businessman. He writes, the dead and wounded would lie side by side in the driveway leading up to the foreign ministry. The garden, like the rest of Chung-Shan-Lu, is strewn with cast-off pieces of military equipment. At the entrance is a wheelbarrow containing a formless mask, obstinately a corpse, but the feet show signs of life. It is not until we tour the city that we learn of the extent of the destruction. We come across corpses every 100 to 200 yards. Bodies of civilians that I have examined had bullet holes in their backs. These people had presumably been fleeing and were shot from behind. But John Rabb pictured here. But no. So often, as a result, when you see a lot of U.S. propaganda about the Japanese, they're often going to allude back to this kind of wild and barbaric image of the Japanese, and it's often coming from this, the knowledge, whether it's known or unconscious, of the Japanese Imperial Army's mentality of take no prisoners, leave no survivors. Seeming mentality. But another thing that kind of sets the United States and Japan at odds is the Axis powers forming in 1940. Perhaps a bit oddly, the Germans and the Japanese and the Italians would ally together, even though due to distance, Japan and Germany were effectively cut off from direct contact from one another. They had much of the British Empire, like India and Egypt, between them. So they were quite cut off from each other. Further, it's kind of odd, but at least it seems odd to me, but they both saw themselves as master races over humanity, and you'd think that given their their racist beliefs, the Nazis and the Empire of Japan, you'd think that familiarity would breed contempt, because they both claimed they were the superior race. I guess due to distance, that debate never came up a whole lot. So anyways, despite all this, the Japanese, the Germans, and the Italians all agreed on a few different points that were bigger uniting factors than anything else. One thing is they all agreed that the colonial systems built by the British and the French particularly needed to go. Russia and its communism was a problem. And the three of them each wanted to own their own massive corner of the world, which you can see detailed here. Here's kind of a map of what they looked like about in 42. But so their goals are destroy these two empires, containment/annihilation of Soviet-style communism, and a creation of a new world order. And there's their leaders photoshopped together. Now, the United States, we would cause some problems because, while we would proclaim neutrality, the United States would proclaim neutrality, we would frequently bankroll and support people who fought the Axis powers. Like we helped the British with the Lend-Lease Act. We would also help Chinese nationalists fight off the Japanese. Originally, I believe we were funding them to fight off the communists, but they could turn around and fight the Japanese, was the theory. So, obviously, we weren't going to be... The United States was not necessarily... We had neutrality, the United States had neutrality, but that didn't mean we weren't trying to influence these different regions. Another thing that really sets off the United States is we put up a trade embargo in 1941 with the invasion of French Indochina. French Indochina is a French colony. It's modern-day Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. And there, in case you're wondering. And here's a closer-up map of it. A German map, incidentally. And the reason why this is kind of a big deal is the Japanese wanted it for its resources. There's rubber, Michelin tires, anyone? There's coffee and tea in this area, tin, coal, rice, other things. And so when attacking this French colony really annoyed the United States, and we put up this trade embargo. And really what this did to the Japanese is it reminded them that one day, sooner rather than later, they would have to fight the United States of America for dominance in the Pacific. But also there's some pressure with the Burma Road, which comes up a lot. But remember, as always, you can pause my slideshows. You can access my slideshows through the links in the description of the video below. Anyways, let's roll to it. Finally, we get to the part of the lecture where the title comes from. Japan launches a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, located in the Hawaii Territory of the United States of America. This is on December 7th, 1941. As President Franklin Delano Roosevelt will call it, the day that will live in infamy. Essentially, the crown jewels of the U.S. Asiatic Fleet are parked in Pearl Harbor, and many ships, such as the battleships Arizona and Oklahoma, and 100 other so ships, are key targets for the Japanese military in attacking Pearl Harbor. Now I'll have a video that goes into more detail of like how the attack works. I just want to focus on the core takeaways of what's going on. And the purposes of this attack is the Japanese goal was to stun and delay the U.S.'s response time. By damaging the U.S. fleet operating in the Pacific, this would allow the Japanese to attack British colonies like Hong Kong, swipe the Philippines from the United States, and begin working towards Australia and British India. In fact, they would reach a point where they were bombing mainland Australia, such as Darwin, Australia. And so that was the idea, was if you could knock out the Pacific Fleet quickly, the Japanese could capture all these territories and fortify them and prepare for counterattack, which is the case here. There was also a hope by some Japanese that the United States would be cowardly and kind of just back off and allow these things to happen. And if you look at it, it's not that far off of an assumption. The United States, in an effort to continually avoid conflict, we'd overlooked the Panay incident. While we didn't really like the rape of Nanking was not well received in the United States, nor was the French Indochina invasion well received. The United States never really did any major actions that directly hammered the Japanese in a serious way. And so there was kind of a hope that the U.S. would back off. And they weren't wrong with that. In some regards, the United States was planning on giving the Philippine Islands their independence, as detailed in a previous lecture. Let's talk about the successes of the attack. Now, the attack itself did do considerable damage. It was a shock to many Americans. You can see the stats here on the screen. Thousands of U.S. personnel were killed or injured. This is particularly damaging because when the war breaks out, anyone who's already trained is a key asset in a conflict. The USS Arizona and the USS Oklahoma were sunk. 300 plus aircraft were either damaged or destroyed, along with heavy damage done to the airfields that could launch them. Many other ships required extensive repairs before going back into battle. And the U.S. fleet was largely unable to deploy any serious defensive fleets to hold on to the Philippines or Guam. Essentially, we were able to send enough resources to evacuate some people from the Philippines, but we really just didn't have those resources. Around the same time, the Japanese were able to start attacking and take Hong Kong, push into Burma. And then the other thing this did is the attack on Pearl Harbor, well, it surprised the Germans. They declared war on the United States. And so this meant the United States would be fighting a two-front war, one in Europe and one in the Pacific. And that would divide American attention and American resources, which would give the Japanese more time to essentially capture these places and dig in and get ready for an American counterattack. However, and just so you know, the United States declares war on Japan on December 8th, 1941. In our class, we will watch the video where Franklin Delano Roosevelt tells Congress, this is why we're going to war, we're going to war. So you get to hear that speech, a clip of that speech. There are a few issues with what happens when the Japanese attack. There is a number of what most historians would consider failures, and most military analysts. One, big one, is they missed the entire U.S. submarine fleet was untouched by dive bombers. The battleships, which were, they're massive ships. They're the crown jewels of a fleet, especially World War I, they put in treaty regulations to regulate the size of battleships because they were seen as the hammers, the grand flagships of any fleet. So the submarines were overlooked. However, when the United States declared war on Japan on December 8th, 1941, the U.S. let slip the subs of war. Pardon the pun. Essentially, in the Pacific, we would wage unrestricted submarine warfare, and this would haunt the Japanese the entire war. Now, while the U.S. submarine fleet in the Pacific is not as famous as the infamous German U-boats on the Atlantic, or under the Atlantic, actually, the U.S. submarine fleet was far more effective and far more damaging. Over half of the ships, of the Japanese merchant ships that were sunk during the war, were brought down by these submarines. And the Japanese would soon learn that if you wanted to have an ocean-based, well-supplied empire, you probably needed to do something about those submarines. And they never quite did. And so U.S. submarines would brutally attack Japanese anywhere they could be found throughout the entire war. Additionally, the United States had lucked out, and at the time, the U.S. aircraft carriers, the Enterprise, the Lexington, and the Saratoga were all out in the Pacific Ocean. Now, instead of big guns, these ships carried airplanes as their main weapon, and these airplanes carried bombs. Combined with submarines, these three aircraft carriers would roughly make up the U.S. Pacific Fleet until the mighty shipyards of the West Coast could be activated into building ships. Now, because it's interesting, and I really want to talk about it, I just want to talk about the three aircraft carriers and what the Japanese really suffered when they failed to get these aircraft carriers, because these aircraft carriers are probably the symbols of modern warfare, and certainly that proves it with these. So starting with the USS Lexington, named for that Revolutionary battle, she would perish in the Battle of Coral Sea, and this was a grim loss because right off the bat, that ship represented 1/4 of the U.S. Pacific Carrier Fleet, which effectively in 42 was the U.S. Pacific Fleet. However, her other sisters would do better. The USS Enterprise would down over 900 planes and sink or destroy 200 ships during World War II. Essentially double or triple that for every ship attacked at Pearl Harbor and every aircraft attacked at Pearl Harbor. And she would retire from the war, and surviving the war, retire peacefully. The USS Saratoga, an old aircraft carrier out of the shipyards in New Jersey, was built on the frame of a 1917 battle cruiser, and she'd be a tough one to sink. This 888-foot-long vessel survived torpedo hits, bomb runs, fires, as well as the entire Second World War. She only rests at the bottom of the Bikini Atoll because in 1946 the U.S. took the retired ship for nuclear target practice. And in case you're wondering, it took 2 nuclear warheads to sink the retired Saratoga. But I think I'll stop there. This concludes part 1 of the World War II unit. We've seen the start of the war now, and anyways, in the next lecture we'll pick up with the U.S. in the thick of things fighting the Second World War. I guess that's all, and until later.